Hey everybody, welcome back to What Would Charlie Shoot? We are on episode number 7 today, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you how I got to meet and befriend Robert Frank. And so before I get started today, I just want to bring up a couple things. If you're listening to my podcast, thank you so much for dropping by first and foremost. If you're a photographer, if you want to learn, if you want to go ahead and grow, you're in the right spot. I also want to bring up that I've got an Udemy class. If anybody wants to take the class, it is going to be $10 for the rest of the month of November. And we're going to have a little Black Friday special where it's going to stay $10 until the end of November. Where else can you get a class for $10 in photography? Let me know. We're going to answer some questions today. We're going to talk about some new projects as well that I'm pretty excited about. And we're going to go from there. And so first, I want to go ahead and tell you the story about how I met and befriended Robert Frank. If you don't know Robert Frank, he's a very heavy hitter in the history of photography. He's the one that actually wrote the book called The Americans. The Americans was a cross-country road trip where Robert Frank wanted to document everyday life of Americans, and he actually took about 500 rolls of film, 3 cameras, and his family across the United States back in the 50s to make it happen. And so he's one of the first to kind of give us the gift of street photography and things of that sort to actually take the candid pictures and take them to a different level. And so I'm going to tell you the story about how I actually met Robert Frank and how I knew him for a couple years before he passed away, unfortunately. I'm going to tell you a little story here real quick. So I remember it was just like yesterday. It was summertime, and a friend and I were walking down Bleecker Street in New York City. The breeze was blowing through the trees, and we had finished a photo shoot in NoHo. My friend needed to stop by an art store to buy supplies for his paintings, so we found a spot not too far from New York University. We doubled back to Bleecker Street to visit a small wine bar owned by one of his friends, and we saw him. I turned to my friend and said, "That is Robert Frank." My friend looked at me and asked, "Who is Robert Frank?" I explained the history of photography to my friend and shared that Robert Frank is a legend. He is the photographer that started my love of street photography. He is the rebel who dared to destroy the images he did not love. And he was standing 20 feet away from us on Bleecker Street. Now, most people get very excited when they see celebrities, overly excited. Me being me does not too much. I photographed a lot of really famous people in my career. I've seen and photographed people that most only dream of meeting in their life, but when you meet one of your heroes, I suppose it's a bit different. My jaw hit the sidewalk as we got closer to where Robert Frank was standing. It was him. My professors had turned me on to Robert's work in photography classes. He was a photographer that got a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1955 to take a cross-country road trip to document American life. This road trip led to 767 rolls of film photographed total, and Robert would cull it down to 1,000 images for his famous book called The Americans. This book is shared by photography teachers that share the history of photography, and this book made Robert Frank the legend that he was. Now, my first Robert Frank experience was on Bleecker Street, as I mentioned, and as we approached Robert Frank, my friend asked if I thought it would be cool to paint him. My friend's a really great painter, and he photographs and paints also, and he does his paintings about 6 minutes flat, and that's that. So my friend was cool as a cucumber, and I was freaking out silently about what I would say to Robert Frank. I said I thought it would be okay to paint him with his permission, so my friend approached him first. I stood back in silent wonder and awe at what was happening before my eyes. Robert agreed to let my friend paint him. People began to gather around us as they saw what was happening on the street. I did not want to offend Robert by any means, so I made one photograph shot from the hip. Robert immediately pointed at me and replied, "You just photographed me, didn't you?" I am very quick on my feet, so I served my camera up to Robert Frank like a waiter serving a fine bottle of wine at a restaurant, and I said, "Look at this amazing image that I made of you," to which we all laughed. I had to excuse myself to leave to teach, but I thanked Robert Frank for the opportunity to meet him before I was on my way. I knew it was not the time to tell him exactly how much his work had influenced me. Now, I didn't have the time or the opportunity to ask him on the first day how to actually give him a copy of the photos I made for him, but in my heart I knew if you make a photograph of someone, you give them a gift and you share it with them. So I decided to make some prints old school, and I packed them in an envelope. I was going to be near Bleecker Street again in about a week, and I thought it was possible to run into Robert again. So as I walked down Bleecker Street on a day I visited with my pack of prints, my heart raced with anticipation. Would he be there? He was. I found Robert sitting on a standpipe in the street with his shirt unbuttoned and his famous Leica camera around his neck. As I approached, I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Frank, do you remember me?" Robert replied, "Yes, I remember you. You are the man that photographed me last week," to which we both laughed. I shared that I had a gift for him as I nervously handed him the black and white prints I had made. Robert opened the envelope right there on the street and started to thumb through my work. He replied, "These are very good," and I was blown away by delight. Robert saying he said that my work was good, holy shit. We sat and talked about photography, life, and what we both enjoyed about the day. I had to excuse myself to leave for work again, and Robert said if we ever crossed paths again, I was always welcome to say hello. In the 2 years that I had the pleasure of befriending Robert Frank, I made a point to visit him as much as possible. I always took him a handful of small prints, and I had no idea if other photographers did this or not, but it often led to enlightening conversations where we talked for a couple hours each time. Robert became a great friend of mine, and the influence on my photography became tenfold fortified. I did not have a chance to visit him in the final 6 months before he passed, but after hearing of his passing, I returned to Bleecker Street to his home. There was a grand outpouring of cards, flowers, and memories taped to the windows. His wife June had handwritten a touching letter to everyone on their remembrance and support on the window. As I documented the memorial, remembering and honoring my friend, a man approached me and asked me if I was there for Robert. I replied that I was, and we both started talking about photography. The man reached into his backpack and pulled out a black and white photograph of Robert in his hand. He said he wanted to give me the photograph and that it was an original print. I asked the man if, when he photographed Robert, as it looked like Robert was very young. The man replied that the photograph was from 40 years prior. My eyes opened wide as the stranger handed me the gift from the year I was born. I thanked him for his kindness and promised to always keep the print safe and treasure it in my collection. This is a question I have always asked myself in mind as I photograph. What would Robert do? It has led me to many different adventures and conclusions. I don't know if I'll ever have a conclusive answer to it, but what do I know is that I'm very grateful to have met and befriended Robert. I have sought out many of my photographic heroes and other heroes in my life. When you meet one of your heroes, you always wonder if they'll live up to your expectations, and Robert lived up to and exceeded mine. So that's my story about how I met and befriended Robert Frank. He gave me a lot of tips and a lot of tricks that he had experienced in his life over the years that I got to know him, and I was very fortunate to be one of the many that actually befriended and understood Robert Frank to some capacity on there. And so I want to talk a little bit today about the class thing as well. If you're a photographer, I'm doing this brand new thing called photo coaching. If you've never heard about photo coaching before, it's sort of like a mentorship where we get a Zoom call together and I tell you how you can actually achieve the goals that you want to do in your photography. Now, I can teach you basic photography, but anybody can really jump on YouTube these days. Anybody can learn f-stops, apertures, and shutter speeds. I believe in actually listening to you and listening to what you want to achieve in our class time together so I can give you the best experience possible and to accomplish just that. So if you want to learn something like that where you'll set up a photo coaching session with me, feel free to jump over to my Calendly. I'll link it up below, or you can visit my website, charlienaebeck.com, and you can schedule a 30-minute consultation with me for free, and we'll talk about how I can help you with your photography. Also, don't forget my class over on Udemy. I've got that for just $10 for the remainder of November before Black Friday, and you'll be able to learn photography from that as well, to all the skills that you need to jump out there and make the images that you love. Thanks again for joining me here on What Would Charlie Shoot, and I'll see you next week.